about 20 minutes now, just to kind of set the stage a bit and get us thinking about work through a justice lens. And obviously work isn't only about justice. There's loads that we could say around the theology of work. We can think about calling and vocation. That stuff's really important, and there are great resources out there. I particularly recommend LICC have sort of a series of study guides called Rooted, and that's a really good place to go, I think, just to kind of get some basics. But I'm going to go quite narrow and quite deep rather than broad in this talk. I'm hoping to stretch the conversation a bit beyond the basics. So I'll start with a few comments just around like managing our expectations. And then for most of this talk, I'm just going to throw ideas around about the kinds of questions that I think you should be asking when it comes to seeking justice with your careers. So I'm afraid I don't really have any neat answers, or I certainly don't have many neat answers with this stuff. But I really hope that some of what I cover might open up some new possibilities, or it might just spark some new ideas for those of you who don't really have much of a clue what comes next at the moment. So I'll pass over, once I'm done, I'm going to pass over to these 5 amazing alumni who've joined us, and you can ask them questions and they can share a lot of their wisdom. But yeah, that's where we're going. Some of what I'm going to say is deliberately a bit kind of challenging. I hope that's something that you're up for. I do want to be really cautious with this because we're talking about your futures, and that is a big deal. I don't want to take it lightly. So I want you to know from the start that I'm not an authority on this stuff. I've thought about it a bit. I've read what some smarter people had to say, but the reality is I'm a 27-year-old who's only had one adult job. So do weigh what I have to say, pray it through, don't take it as gospel. But before we go into a bunch of questions that I think you need to be thinking through, I wanted to manage expectations a little bit when it comes to thinking about work. For those of you graduating this year, you probably don't need me to tell you that this is not going to be an easy environment for job hunting. And that may well be true for those of you graduating in 2 years or 3 years. This isn't to get you down, but it's probably helpful just to start with a bit of healthy realism. So I'm just going to share my screen for you. And then we'll get going. So, managing expectations. First thing to say with this is that you probably won't get your dream job straight away. There might be exceptions, but for those of us who've been raised on a culture of instant gratification, this can be quite hard. You might have a clear idea of what you want to do, and sometimes then anything else can feel disappointing. But there will be points in many of our lives where we might not have the luxury of choice, where we kind of just have to take whatever work we can get. And by the way, that's true of pretty much all humans who've ever lived. We just happen to be in a very tiny minority who do have the luxury of choice when it comes to the work we do. That's okay, because there's no such thing as a perfect job. Just because many of us aren't going to get loads of job offers when we graduate, it's all right. There's no such thing as a perfect job. You can serve God faithfully in a work environment that is unideal. And actually that will set you up really well for whatever comes after that. So that's the first thing to say. Next up is just that meaningful work is hard. Our culture has created this myth that for something to be authentic, it has to be effortless. And that means that whenever we find something hard, we start to worry that maybe this isn't what God has called us to do. But that's a myth. I just don't think it has any grounding in the Bible. Because this side of new creation, all meaningful work is going to be hard a lot of the time. It's going to cost us. We'll find ourselves giving far more than we're getting a lot of the time. And that will become more true the more leadership responsibility we take on. And we'll find that we're working with people that we find difficult, or situations that are really difficult. And again, that will be even more so when we're fighting for justice, when we're on the front lines of justice work. We are going to expect pushback. there, you know, there will be good things as well. This isn't to say all meaningful work is going to be horrible. There will be really good things as well. There'll be things to celebrate, but I do think we need to be realistic and have a realistic idea of how hard work will be. Otherwise, I think we set ourselves up for a bit of a miserable time. Next, you might not get a clear sense of God calling you to a specific job. Some of you will, and that's great. Praise God when that happens. It's very convenient. But not all of us will have that kind of clear sense of calling or vocation. Most of what I have to say tonight probably really is aimed at people who are not sure what they want to do. And if that's you, don't worry. You're not less qualified to work for justice. In many ways, it actually gives you more flexibility. So don't be paralyzed. Probably the best thing you can do is to just try some things out. Use your head as well as your heart. Do things that are going to give you skills that will enable you to bear fruit in the long run. Next, some jobs will have thousands of times more impact than others. A website like 80,000hours.org can be helpful for exploring and comparing the impact of different careers. And they look at things from quite a utilitarian point of view. So we want to be a bit cautious in how we interact with that kind of stuff from a Christian worldview, but I still think it's helpful. We probably just want to define justice impact as something like basically, loving people well. Some jobs will enable us to love people far better than others. And then the final thing to say, just in managing expectations, is that you do not need to have an impressive or successful career to glorify God and to serve others. It's really important to stress that. Now, most of us are going to spend around 80,000 hours of our lives at work. And that means that for many of us, our jobs will be the arena of our life where we have the greatest potential to do good, the greatest potential to work for justice. But that will not be true for all of us. And for some of us, our health is going to limit how much we're able to work. For others, we're going to sacrifice our careers to raise or foster children or to care for a loved one. And it's really important just to stress right at the start that those are not lesser options in the kingdom. Those are beautiful ways of serving Jesus. So we're focusing on careers tonight. And although we're focusing on careers tonight, although work really matters, it's not the only way to glorify God and serve others. So there you go. Those are some of the brutal facts, maybe, that are good to confront as we set out. Happily, none of these make glorifying God or serving others with our work impossible. None of them mean that we can't see God's justice done through our work. They probably just mean that we need to be ready to wrestle a bit, ready to embrace some challenge, ready to negotiate some ambiguities. And all of that is a whole load of opportunity for us to grow as disciples. So there we go. There's some expectations at the start. Now I've got 11 questions that I think you want to be asking. They won't take long to go through, but let's jump straight in. The first question that I think is good to ask is this: what are my motives? What are my motives? Obviously, that's a huge question, and often quite hard to know, but it's really important that we wrestle with it. What hopes and fears might be impacting your thoughts about your future? And maybe, if you're honest with yourself, a desire for power or prestige or status or comfort is kind of unhelpfully influencing the career decisions that you're making. Now, ambitious careerism is a massive idol in Durham, and one which I think all too easily we can sort of baptize in the church when we talk about something like, I don't know, changing the world for Jesus or having influence. Those not bad things, but sometimes I think we risk putting a bit of a Jesus gloss on rampant ambition. Do we feel a sense of entitlement that we should earn a certain amount, or we should aspire to a certain lifestyle? What if God wanted us to lay those down? Or maybe we have unhelpful motives in the other direction, and this can often be a bit more subtle, but maybe actually there's a fear of having a job with a lot of responsibility or with a high wage, and that might actually be equally unhelpful as a motive. So it's good to name those deep motives and good to allow God to speak into them. So that's the first thing to say. Next up, where am I called and who with. Now, it's easy to frame calling in quite an individualistic way, but biblical calling is first of all to God, and secondarily, it often comes to a family or to a community or to a place. Sometimes all of those. In various ways, that's going to involve self-denial and self-giving rather than the kind of secular mantra of self-fulfillment. Careers don't happen in the abstract. They happen in real places with real people. And as well as thinking about what you're called to, think hard about where you might be called to do it and who with. Because for some of us, the where and the who might actually be more important. They might come before the what. And that's okay. We need to be clear on what we value higher than our jobs and ensure that we live into those values. Now, there's nothing wrong about moving to London, living in a comfortable suburban location with a spouse, 2 kids, and a Labrador. But why is that our default? And I'm not assuming that might not be our default, but I think for a lot of Durham students, that's the kind of default. Why do we so often assume that that's the only viable option as we follow Jesus? Should we? There's not a shortage of thriving, well-resourced churches with young congregations in London. That is not true of most other places in the country. And that's not to say don't move to London, but just think about it. I think that God will be calling many of us not to the centres of power, but to the margins, to places that have been abandoned and forgotten. Maybe for some of us, that could look like choosing to stay in the Northeast after you graduate, or perhaps joining an evening team and moving into a deprived neighbourhood. Again, not all of us, but some of us, I really think that might be the case. And for many of us, God might want us to reconsider what family life looks like in the kingdom of God. That might mean living in intentional community, or practicing radical hospitality, or fostering and adopting. So think about where God might be calling you and who with. For some of us, those will be more important than what we do with our careers. And especially if you're feeling really uncertain or stressed about what you do, maybe it's worth just stepping back a bit and thinking and praying about where and who with. Next, what can I sustainably do? And knowing your limits is really important. We've been created with the gift of limits. Limits of time and space, health and energy, limits to our relational and emotional capacity. It's worth thinking about what you would need to say no to in order to say yes to a particular career. And remember, meaningful work is going to be hard a lot of the time. So this piece about sustainability is not about opting out of hard work. It's not about saying, oh, that's hard, I can't do it. But it's about each of us being realistic about our limits. Trying to transcend those limits isn't sustainable, and it can do all sorts of damage to us and to others. We don't glorify God by trying to be God. So think, what can I sustainably do? Next, am I going to be more like Jesus? Or am I going to become more like Jesus? This is huge. If we're not growing into mature followers of Jesus, then that will limit what we are able to give to others. This is not to say that we should all go and work for the church, because the church isn't always, working for the church isn't always the best place for our spiritual growth. Sometimes it is, but not always. But think about spiritual practices. They are the means by which we become more like Jesus. So will practices like Sabbath, simplicity, or fasting be possible in the workplace that you're considering? Equally, could the rhythm of work be conducive to practices like celebration, intercession, evangelism, or giving? Try to find older Christians in careers that you're considering and talk to them about their experience. Next, how can I best use my gifts? What are you good at? What comes effortlessly to you? If you're not sure, then why not ask a few people who know you well, or do a test like StrengthsFinder? we can sometimes have a bit of a false humility as Christians when it comes to knowing our gifts, but it is a good thing to be confident in. And God has given each of us these unique gifts. How can we best use them to glorify Him and serve others? And then kind of similarly, what am I passionate about? God may give some of us really clear passions. Passion is important. Passion has a place, but I do want to put in a bit of a caveat here. A lot of career advice that I've heard is basically a kind of follow your passion narrative, which isn't necessarily wrong, but I wonder if it just feels a bit more in line with Disney than it does with the Bible. We need to use our heads as well as our hearts. Hearts matter, the heads do too. And otherwise we risk mistaking vocation for the subjectivity of our own ego. In other words, we risk just doing things that we kind of want to do, but without considering how that will impact others. So if there are things that you're passionate about, great, but consider how you can best live into that passion. So if, for example, you have a passion to fight homelessness, amazing, then you could go and work for a charity on the front lines, running a homeless shelter or whatever. Or maybe you could start a business that employs homeless people, and that might actually start to get to some of the roots of the issue rather than just addressing symptoms. Or you might want to go into politics in order to change the broken systems that make people homeless in the first place. And you could influence legislation around affordable housing that could affect the lives of thousands of homeless people. Passion is important, but you still want to ask, where could you have the greatest impact? Where could you use the gifts that God's given you? So again, to stress, it's okay if you don't have a clear thing or a clear issue that you're passionate about. I don't. But don't wait until God breaks your heart for something before you start to seek justice. And more often than not, I think passion is something that we kind of grow into in time. Next, am I thinking long term? Often I find that students who are passionate about justice want to go straight into the front line or into kind of frontline justice work when they graduate. And there's nothing wrong with that. But I would urge just a bit of caution, because I've seen far too many friends go straight into working for small charities where their job was mundane, where they weren't managed or developed or treated very well. And unsurprisingly, they burn out. So I wonder if there can sometimes be a bit of an instant gratification thing that makes us want to feel like we have a tangible impact from day one in our professional life. But instead, I'd encourage you to have a kind of long-term perspective. What skills could you develop now that will multiply the impact that you can have in 30 years? Often this will mean not going straight into the charity sector. Often the charity sector is not the best place to get upskilled or developed. And that's not true of all charities. Many are great. Henry is one of our panelists tonight. He works for Handcrafted. They're fantastic. I'm confident that he's been upskilled really well there. But do your research. Don't just assume that that's the best place to go. Often you're going to be far more useful to a charity if you go and train, I don't know, as an accountant or as a lawyer or as a consultant, and get really good at that. And then you can either you can give away enough to basically fund multiple jobs at that charity, or you can sit in a non-paid role on a board, which is so valuable and so important, particularly in places in the country where there is not a whole load of like really skilled people to do that. Or you can transition into working for a non-profit and use the kind of skills that you've learned to have a much greater impact than you would as a new graduate. So I think long term, hopefully that's quite freeing if you're in a place where you don't have any idea what you want to do next. Not many of us are going to spend our whole lives just in one career. Most of us will shift around a fair bit. So if you're not sure where to start, then don't worry. In a sense, it doesn't matter too much. Obviously, it matters a bit, but it doesn't matter too much. It's not going to define the rest of your life. So I think a solid option is just start somewhere where you feel you're going to get pushed, where you're going to get upskilled really well, and then keep your options fairly broad. Next, how generous can I be? Perhaps the salary of a particular job will mean that you can give half your income away. Perhaps you will learn skills that you can serve others with. Perhaps the job will allow you to invest time and energy in a local community or in family or in your church. And generosity comes in many forms, but whatever career options you're considering, make sure you're thinking about how it's going to enable you to bless others. And these final two questions. Did I just go from 8 till 9? I think I missed out 9. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Whatever number this is, if you're considering, this is a bit more specific, if you're considering working in the private sector, so going to like a business, then I think you need to be asking this kind of question. What good and what harm does this company do to people and to creation? Research the company, basically. Look into who owns it. Look at whether they pay taxes. Look into the transparency of their supply chains. Look at how they treat their workers. Look into their environmental policies and their waste management. Look at where they invest their money. Look at whether they donate to particular political parties. And look beneath the company's own marketing. It's going to require a bit of effort to do that, and not many companies will come out of that perfect. But with such a big decision about where you work, it's really not okay, I think, to go in blind or just kind of assuming that it's probably fine. Given that there are going to be very few companies that will be kind of squeaky clean in all of those areas, you're probably going to find yourself having to work out where the line is. Like, how do you compromise on that? How much do you compromise? I wonder if maybe one of the kind of question you want to be asking there is something like, would it be better to work to transform an imperfect company, or to work for a company with better ethics? And there's not always an easy answer there, but I think that's the kind of question to be weighing up when it comes to those tricky decisions. So that's for the private sector. Then the final one, if you're considering going into the charity sector, I think the big question to be asking is this charity effective? Some of the crew at 80,000 Hours, who I mentioned before, they would argue that working for or giving to an ineffective charity is as damaging as working for the arms trade. I don't know how fair that is. It's certainly like a bit of a shocking one, but at least it reinforces the point. Having good intentions is not enough if we want to love people well. And there's lots of charities that actually probably end up doing more harm than good because they're not effective in addressing the issues that they care about. So the question then becomes, how do you gauge a charity's effectiveness? And I put some little guide points on the slide there. And that first point, are they addressing issues of great importance to social justice, is really key. So like a really obvious example is going to be like, I don't know, climate change is of astronomically greater importance than getting a new playground at the village school. That's the kind of thing. And obviously there'll be tighter examples, but just to illustrate that. And then that second thing, are they engaging with the best practices in development? And then I put a little breakdown of what that kind of looks like. So are they addressing root causes, not just symptoms? Are they doing any harm? Now, an example of this might be something like orphanages. Now, any number of studies will show you that being raised in an institution rather than by a family actively harms children. But far too often we kind of uncritically fund or support orphanages across the world. So are they doing any harm? That's important to ask. And then next, are they empowering local communities and local leaders? Too often charities import solutions, but that's not a sustainable way to build a community's resilience. And then finally, are they using evidence learning? Are they learning from careful analysis and evaluation of what actually works? So there we go. Those are some real basics. If you're thinking about working for a charity, please learn about good development. Read a book like When Helping Hurts. It's a really good place to start. Don't go into it assuming that good intentions are enough, or you might end up inadvertently harming those that you want to help. Right, I'm going to come off screen share now. Those are the questions that I would just encourage you to think through. It's not an exhaustive list, it's just kind of what I came up with over the last couple of weeks. But I hope some of that's helpful. To end, I just want to, I think it just brings us back to the gospel and bring us back to grace. If you're feeling uncertain about the future, that's okay. It's okay to try something out and get it wrong and try something else. Remember that the primary calling on all of our lives is to God. And he is delighted in you before you've done any work. And we work from that place of total security, not for it. We work from peace, not for it. We work from the identity of being beloved children of the King, not for that identity. And that gives us like an incredible freedom to approach the future, neither with a kind of frantic anxiety, nor with a sort of withdrawn fatalism, but with resurrection purpose. We can trust that we can encounter the risen Jesus even in the most mundane of tasks. We can join in with his mission to restore all things, including work. I really hope that some of that's been helpful. I hope it sparked some new ideas or stretched your thinking a bit. I'm really happy to chat about more of this. I find this interesting. I'm still working a lot of this stuff out, and this is just where I'm at the moment. If you ask me this in a few weeks, I might have different ideas. But please do get in touch if you want to chat more. I'd be really happy to do that.